Hey guys, so today we're going to be continuing on with our object inventory. So we will be adding how to pick up items and how to then drop them from the inventory. Alright, so let's get started. Let's jump into the step event of our inventory object. So remember, this was where all of our code was for picking up and selecting the items. So we're going to need another case here for dropping the item. So if you remember in our logic here, we say if the pickup slot is not equal to -1. So this means if we are picking something up and then we go ahead and decide what to do with it. But if we are not picking something up, this was our case here. So if we're not picking something up and the item that we're selecting isn't nothing, so that means we are currently hovering over a slot with an item in it. So this is the case that we will want to put in our check for dropping the item. So for me, I'm going to make this a middle click press that will drop the item. So I'm just going to add a heading to this because this was for dropping our pickup item into the new slot. So now we are adding the actual dropping of the item into the game world. And let's just put in our mouse button. And of course we want the button pressed because I don't want to keep dropping things if I'm holding down the middle mouse button. All right. So there's a few things we have to do when we drop the item. So one thing will be to reduce the item count itself. Another thing is to check if, for example, we just had one item in the inventory. If we're dropping that, that means the slot will be reduced to 0. So we're going to have to make the slot into the nothing item. And then of course, we're also going to have to make the item so that it looks like we're actually dropping a real item into the game world. So we'll get this set up. So remember that we already have access to the inventory grid from above, so we can use this variable. So let's reduce the item count. So let's go inv grid. And remember that the item counts were in the second column of this grid. The first column was for the kind of item that it was. So 1. And then for the row that we want in our inventory grid, that will just be whatever slot we're currently selecting, which we have also already set up above. So we can just put selected slot, and then we just can put -=1. And that will get rid of one of the items there. And then of course we need to check. If that was the last one, we need to get rid of it. So now we'll just check if the count, the current count is equal to 0. Let's go ahead and change the item type. So whatever item it was, if it was a carrot, if it was an artichoke, whatever it was, now we're going to set it to be the nothing item. And remember, the first column was the one that was storing what kind of item it was. All right, and I might put that onto the next line. There we go. All right, and now we need to actually create the item. So we haven't made this object yet, so we need to go and do that. So let's come into our objects and we're going to create a new one. And I'll put this, I'll just put this here for now. I'm going to call this obj item. And there's a few things that this object is going to need in its create event. Because what we want it to do, or what I'm going to get it to do, is to basically just draw the same little item picture that is in the inventory slot. So it just looks like we've really just dropped it into the world. So it's going to need a lot of the same information that the inventory has for drawing the slots themselves. So if you remember, we needed some stuff about the size of the slot, we needed the sprite that we were getting, and we'll need the item's location on our sprite sheet. So it has to be one of these. And also actually, before I forget, I'm just going to make this a child of our parent depth object so that it also has its depth being controlled in our game. So we need to put event inherited up the top so that it's inheriting all of the parent depth object and collision stuff. All right, so the first thing I'm going to put in is the cell size for our items. Obviously, if yours is different, you're going to have to put a different number here, but for us, it was just 32. I'm just going to make a variable called item SPR for sprite, and that's just going to store the sprite inventory items. So next we need the sprite width and height. So you probably remember a lot of this code from before. And there's actually a couple more things that it needs. It needs an item number. So this is the thing that you will want to set if you're going to put an item into the game world. So you'll want to specify what kind of item it's going to be with the item number. So remember, that was just a long index that we had here for all of our different kinds of items. And then we're also going to need the item X frame and Y frame, which just means, so for example, the potatoes would have an X frame of 2 because it's 0, 1, 2 across. and a Y-frame of 0 because it's on the first column. So that's how we were getting what item it kind of was. But by default, when this item is created, that's fine for us to just set it to, well, anything we want really, because this should be updated at some point. All right, so now we can come into its draw event and get it to actually draw itself. Okay, so we just draw sprite part, and we will just refer to that item sprite. To be honest, you could just put that in here, but I generally like to set this as an instance variable in case I have many kinds of drawings in the event and I don't want to go and change this later. So the sub image will just be 0 because we don't have any frames. So now, of course, we have to get the X and Y location of the part of the sprite that we're drawing. So remember how I said that potato, we want this right here. So that would actually be the cell size times the X frame. So we put X frame times cell size, and the same for the Y, but the Y frame. The width and height of the cell is cell size. And now the X and Y location, we're just going to put this as wherever the item currently is. But we should note that because of how the sprite is anchored, this kind of means that it's going to be drawing it at the top left as if the origin was the top left of the sprite. So we might actually have to add an offset later. But for now, this is fine. So now that we have the object, let's come back to the inventory so that we can actually create it. And remember, we will want to be changing these variables here. So I might just copy this and we'll come back to the inventory, come back to the step event and back to what we were doing before. So in here, we will need to create the item. So we can go var inst for instance create layer. And now, where should we create it? Well, I'm just going to create it at the player's X and Y location in the instances layer, and the kind of item is obj item. All right, so we have created it. Now we need to actually modify the item number and the X frame and Y frame variables. So we go with inst, and I'm just going to paste what we had in the create event. All right, so for the item number, we actually already have access to this up here when we were getting what kind of item it was that we were selecting. So we can actually just grab that. The item number is going to be equal to this. And remember, when you're going into a with statement, you don't have access to any of the inventory's instance variables, but this one is fine. This one is a local variable. So it exists while this code block is running. All right, and now the X and, whoops, that should be Y frame, is just going to be the item number mod. So the width of the cell divided by the cell size. So that is going to get us the number of frames that are in the width. So the width divided by the cell size will get us the number of frames right here, which is what we want. And then the same for the Y frame, but instead of mod, we use div. And I might also just add a debug message. So that should come up in the console when we drop the item. All right, I think we're ready to run the game. So let's hit F5. All right, so here are our items. So let's just drop one of these picture frames. So it's at 3, it should reduce to 2. There we go. So it's dropped into the game world. And so just like I said, it's kind of dropped so that the origin of our item is here. So we actually probably want to give this an offset so that the item itself is anchored at this point right here. Anyway, let's just do another test. So let's drop this chili. So this should reduce to the nothing item if we drop it. There we go. We also might want to just give it a bit more randomness when we drop the item. So maybe we want it to fly off in a random direction. So those are two things we have to do. So first we'll fix the offset. So let's come back to the sprite. So I might just make the offset at half the width of the sprite horizontally and then make it anchored at the bottom. Or maybe since most of these are kind of centered a little bit towards the middle, we might make it 2/3 of the total width of the cell size. So let's come back to the item and I'm going to add an X offset and I'll make that equal to the cell size over 2 and a Y offset and I'll make that equal to 2/3 of the cell size. So now when we're drawing it, instead of drawing it right at the X and Y location, I'm going to make this at the offset of the X and Y. So X minus the X offset and y minus the y offset. All right, so quickly we'll run that and test it. So now their origin is sort of there because they're getting created exactly where the player's x and y origin is. All right, so now let's make them, when they're created, just fly off in a random kind of direction. I'm going to kind of randomize this. I'm going to have a random direction between 0 and 360. Or 259, because 360 would just be 0 again. And then the distance I want it to fly off in. So this will kind of be, if you imagine the player as being at the center of a circle, how far away do you want the items to fly? So you can set this as whatever you want. I might just make it 32. I'm going to make a goal X and a goal Y for where I want the sprite to end up. So I'm going to make this equal to wherever it currently is, plus, so a random direction, 32 pixels off from where the player is. So GameMaker doesn't really have a way to move in vectors, so what we have to do is convert that vector to a horizontal and vertical component. So if we're moving off to this point over here, how far over to the X is that and how far over to the Y is that? And then we can say, well, go towards that. So that will be, there is a function called length_x, and then you give it a length, which will just be len that we said, and then a direction. And we do the same for the Y. All right, and I'm also going to just make a variable called drop move. And this is going to be set to true initially, and this is going to be saying if we have just dropped it, this will be true, and then once we reach our goal location, we will turn this off. But so long as this is true, we will move towards our goal location. So now let's come into the step event, and we're going to say if drop move, and then we're going to use a function called lerp, which is linear interpolation. If you see here, it has two values and it will make them kind of closer together by some amount. So if we put this, for example, then it's going to go and look at x and goal x. So for example, if we told it to interpolate by 0.5, what this would do is every step, it would kind of halve the distance between them. But this would actually be pretty quick. So I'm going to turn this down to 0.1. Again, you can make this whatever you want. And y. All right. And then I'm going to check if the distance from our goal X is pretty close, so maybe like less than 1, we will turn off this drop move. So let's go if. So this is going to get the difference between X and goal X, the absolute difference. So whatever this value is right here, if it's negative or positive, it's just going to make it positive. So we're just getting the difference. So if this is less than 1, I'm going to say that we're pretty much just at the X location. And we'll do the same for the Y. So if this is the case, then we will turn off drop move. All right, and let's run the game. So I'll just, it's a bit difficult to see with the inventory up, but you can see that they kind of flew off in a random direction. So later we might make it that the game is completely paused and no items can move while the inventory is up. So you will actually be able to see it flying off. But for now, that's fine. So let's move on and add the actual picking up of the items. So basically what we're going to do is check for a kind of collision with the player. And if we are colliding with the player, we are going to pick up the item and destroy the OBJ item that exists in the game world. Except I'm not going to do a straight up place meeting collision with the player. I'm actually going to check if it's within a kind of detection radius. And then if it is within that radius, we're going to be pulled in by the player until we eventually are on top of it. And that is when we will add it to the inventory. All right, so here, but we're only going to be checking this if we have finished being dropped. So we're going to put this in an else, like that. All right, and let's set up our check. So I'm actually going to use the function pointInRectangle, and we're going to basically check if the player is within a kind of rectangle around the item. You could do pointInCircle or something if you wanted it to be circular, but it doesn't really matter. The player won't ever actually see what this looks like. So I'm just going to use a rectangle because they tend to be more performant. So first, I'm actually going to set a radius of 32 around the item. And obviously rectangles don't really have a radius, but we can make it kind of like the half width of the rectangle. And I'm also just going to save the player's X and Y location in some local variables because we're going to be referring to it a couple times. So this function asks for, firstly, what point do you want to check that is in our rectangle? So this will be the px and py, the player's x and player's y. And then we have to give it the coordinates for the rectangle itself. So for the top left corner of the rectangle, it will be x minus r, y minus r, and then for the bottom right. So actually we need to put this in an if check. So if we are within this detection radius, then we need to be doing one of two things, either moving towards the player, or if we are right on top of the player, we will add ourselves to the inventory. So let's do the if we are on top of the player. So I'm actually going to do another rectangle check. But instead of having the radius as 32, I'm going to make this a lot smaller. So if the player is within a very small rectangle of the object, then we will pick it up. So I'm actually going to say if we are not within this, then we will move towards the player. But otherwise, we are right on top of the player, so we will pick it up. So let's firstly do the moving towards the player. That's probably easiest. It's actually going to be exactly the same as this. We'll use lerp again, but instead of the heading towards the goal X and goal Y, we will head towards the player X and player Y. Okay, so that's that. And now we will do the picking up of the item. So now to do this, we will actually have to kind of refer to the inventory object. So to add ourselves to the inventory, we have to tell the inventory what kind of item we are. So we have actually saved what kind of item we are in the item number variable. So whatever this number was from 1 to however many items we had, tomatoes, carrots, whatever, that is the kind of item that it is. So we need to tell the inventory what item we are. So we need to make this a local variable because the rest will be jumping into the inventory itself. Okay, if we're picking up the item, there's a few different cases that can happen. So there might already be an item of the type that we're picking up. So if we're picking up a tomato and we've already got tomatoes in our inventory, then we'll want to stack it onto that existing stack. So we'll want to check if the item already exists in the inventory. Otherwise, we will have to add it to an empty slot if there is one. And if there is no empty slot, then, well, we won't pick up the item. So we will need access to the inventory data structure again. So I'm going to make a data structure as a local variable. So we're going to do that. So I'll just call this ds_inv. So remember, this was our inventory grid that's storing what is in the current inventory. And I'm going to actually make another variable called picked up. And it's going to be false to begin with. But if in some of our checks, we find that it is actually okay to pick it up, so either adding it to an existing point or an empty one, we're going to set this to true, but otherwise we might do something else if it's false. Alright, so let's start off with checking if the item already exists. So we're going to have to loop through our inventory. So remember our format for looping through stuff, so we're going to do a repeat statement. And remember the number of times that we're going to have to repeat is the number of inventory slots. And so because we're in a with statement, we do have access to the instance variables that are in our inventory object. So we had a variable called inventory slots where we set out how many inventory slots we had, and that's how many slots we'll want to check. So we put that. All right, and now every time we loop through a slot, so we're checking if the item itself already exists. And just like before, remember the left column of the inventory grid is what is containing the kind of item that it is. So we're literally going to check if the current row slot that we're on, if that is equal to what we had as our item number of the obj item. The neat thing about this is if you have multiple stacks of, say, tomatoes in your inventory, it's going to add it to the first stack because we're looping through the inventory starting at 0. All right, so we go ds_inv. So all we have to do is add to the current stack. And I'm also going to set picked up equal to true. And we can also put a break so that we break out of the repeat loop, because if we find a slot, we don't have to check the rest. So, but if this statement is not true, then we are going to increment the YY value for the next slot so that we keep looping through this grid. Okay, so that is for checking if the inventory already exists. We're going to do a similar thing for checking if there is an empty slot. So if it goes through all of this and pick up is still false, then we know that it hasn't found a slot that already exists. So what I can say is if it hasn't picked up, then we will go ahead and do this again. And I'll just tab this forwards. There we go. But instead of checking if the current slot is equal to the item number, we check if it is to 0. But if we're just incrementing the number, of course, this is going to make the number of nothing items 1, because if it finds that this is equal to 0, or actually we could have just put nothing, what we'll also want to do is set this equal to our item. So equal to the item number. Otherwise, everything else will be the same. Alright. And now, finally, if we have actually picked up the item itself at any point, so either from finding an item slot where it is already stored or from finding an empty slot, then we are actually going to destroy it. So we're going to check if picked up, and we're going to go instance destroy. Picked up an item. Before we run it, of course, don't forget that we are actually still with the inventory and we don't want to destroy the actual inventory. So let's take this. Make sure that we come outside of the with statement. So if you just highlight this bracket, it should tell you where it ends. So here, and we'll put this here. Because remember, picked up is a local variable, so it should come out of the with statement with us. All right, let's run the game. So let's drop a couple items, and you can see they come back to us. So because you kind of pick them up immediately after you drop them, you might want to add something like a keyboard check for actually drawing the items into you, or you might just want to give a larger window after you've dropped it or something. I might just do the button press though, so I'm going to go if. So I'm just saying if I'm not pressing the O key, then don't do any of this. All right. So let's drop some of these. Right, and they're just falling around the player, and if I hold the O button, they come right to me. And you can see everything is being logged in the console. All right, so that is it for today. So our inventory is starting to really come together. We might add a few more flourishes to it. We might add some item descriptions and so the actual pop-up notifications for picking up the inventory. So that will come next time. So I'd like to thank everyone on Patreon who are supporting me to create these videos. And a special shout out to Danielle Hargrave, Max Molinaro, Uthelian, XD Game Studio, The Great Poultry, Stuart Wells, Monju72, and Hunter T. Thanks for watching guys, that's it for today. I'll see you next time.